how many people today are deficient in omega-3 fatty acids?
That's actually one of the signs of too much inflammation. Some of those prostaglandins actually cause pain, cause fever.
How much pain, inflammation, chronic disease, suffering would be resolved if people could simply correct this deficiency?
Inflammation happens when our physiology is stressed, and inflammation is designed to help us. So together, these lipids that turn off inflammation have been called specialized pro-resolving mediators, or SPMs. Okay.
If people are supplementing, what's the dose you think?
They're more at risk to develop some of the diseases of aging, for example. So I'm talking about cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, maybe cognitive decline. Omega-3 index is strongly related to future disease risk, particularly cardiovascular disease.
What are some symptoms or signs they would know that they are definitely part of that 75%? Hi everyone, we've got a really exciting guest, Dr. Calder. He's a professor of nutritional immunology at the University of Southampton. We're going to talk omega-3s, way beyond fish oil, who might be suffering because they're deficient, how many of us are deficient, and what is the best way to fill this deficiency for more vibrant health, possibly the prevention of disease, better mental health. There's just so many implications of his very important work. So welcome, Dr. Calder.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and let's start at the top because we have so much to talk about and start with the big picture. So how many people today, worldwide, in America, are deficient in omega-3 fatty acids?
So I think it's important, before answering the question, to just establish what you mean by omega-3 fatty acids. So I'm guessing we're mostly going to be talking about EPA and DHA, the sort of the fish-sourced omega-3s. We also have plant forms of omega-3s, particularly alpha-linolenic acid. But if you think about the EPA and DHA, which are really, these are the omega-3s most linked with human health benefits. So we think probably 75% of people all over the world are not getting enough EPA and DHA. So the recommendations are different in different places, but generally speaking, 3/4 of the population are not getting enough. Simple as that. Yeah.
That is wild. And we'll get into specifics and how much you recommend. But so if someone's watching, what are some symptoms or signs they would know that they are definitely part of that 75%?
So, that's a great question. A lot of essential nutrient deficiencies have a disease linked to them that will become apparent relatively soon on. So I'm talking about particular vitamin or mineral deficiencies, for example. With omega-3s, there isn't actually like a frank deficiency disease, but because they're linked to sort of optimal physiology, optimal health, if people are not getting enough omega-3s, they're more at risk to develop some of the diseases of aging, for example. So I'm talking about cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, maybe cognitive decline. All of these things are helped by having more omega-3s available. So I think a long-term lack of these fatty acids is one of the things that underlies the risk that people have for those really common diseases.
Mm-hmm. And I was really inspired by Dr. Bill Land's work. I'm sure you're very familiar. And he had this article called something like Diet Can Do What Drugs Do. And I loved that article. And so how much pain, inflammation, chronic disease, suffering could you estimate would be resolved if people could simply correct this deficiency?
That's a great question. So actually, I can get close to an answer to that. So I mentioned cardiovascular disease, I mentioned metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes, I mentioned cognitive decline. But one of the key things that these fatty acids do is they help control inflammation, so they keep inflammation under control. And that's where their important role in terms of, you call it pain and suffering, because there are conditions that actually do cause pain, like the arthritis, for example, common inflammatory conditions. And we know omega-3s can help with those. There's a big study or group consortium, I suppose, they're called the Global Burden of Disease Group. And mostly they publish their papers in the Lancet. So they look at global data on things. So they're interested in what are the causes of illness and what are the causes of mortality across the globe. They identified in the mid-2000s, quite rightly, that poor diet was a risk factor for getting sick and for mortality, especially from cardiovascular disease, but also from some other diseases that I mentioned. So then they followed that up and they said, well, what is it about a poor diet that's really important? So they published a paper in 2019 where they ranked the top 20 dietary lacks that are associated with disease and the top 20 that are associated with mortality, okay? And a diet low in EPA and DHA came out 6th on both lists. Wow. So they identified that a diet low in EPA is the 6th most important dietary cause of illness and the 6th most important dietary cause of mortality, mostly from cardiovascular disease. To put an exact number on it is tricky, but this is one of the most important dietary insufficiencies that we have, for sure.
Yeah, I've become a little bit obsessed with it, especially because I have noticed such profound changes in my own health since I've kind of been very mindful of this. And we're going to get into the nitty gritty, like how is it doing the inflammation? But I want to talk about your story, nutritional immunology. Fascinating. I can't even imagine. So tell us, what brought you into this work and what exactly do you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I ask myself that all the time. So all of my university education was in biochemistry. So I did a PhD in metabolic biochemistry. And, biochemistry is sort of, how cells function, how they get energy, how they make carbohydrate into fat, how they make protein, stuff like that. Biochemistry is quite aligned with nutrition. I mean, sort of nutrition is biochemistry in real life, I suppose. So when I finished my PhD, I actually started research on how cells of the immune system generate energy. So where does the immune system get its energy from? And one of the things that people had very recently discovered then was the immune system. So people used to think the immune system only used glucose as a fuel. But then they discovered, actually sort of a bit obvious, but the immune system also can derive energy from fatty acids and actually from amino acids as well. So I actually started working on metabolism of fatty acids in cells of the immune system. So that was sort of biochemical immunology, if you like. But what I found was, so if you do an experiment and you put a fatty acid onto some cells, like lymphocytes, for example, macrophages, so proper immune cells, and your intention is to study how do those cells handle that fatty acid, how do they metabolize it. What I found was, this is going way back, what I found was the way the cells were actually working was changing according to the fatty acid exposure, okay? So this completely sidetracked everything. That was 39 years ago, by the way.
Wow.
That completely sidetracked everything into studying how fatty acids influence the function of cells of the immune system. So fatty acids, of course, they are nutritional components. The immune system's about immunology. So that's where the idea of nutritional immunology comes from. So my research group is mainly studying what the effect of dietary components, nutrients and non-nutrients, what the effect is on the functioning of the immune system, including the inflammatory component, because inflammation is part of the immune response.
Yeah.
So that's my story in a nutshell, Autumn.
I love that story. And I think 39 years ago, right? That's when you kind of made this discovery that sent you on this trajectory. So take us, big picture. What was changing based on, tell us about omega-3s, how they end up interacting with immune cells, and how were they different than other fatty acids?
This is all about how cells work. Our bodies are made of cells. Our cells have to function. That's how we stay healthy, if the cells are functioning healthy. So all cells have phospholipid bilayer making a membrane. Their boundary is lipid, and fatty acids make up quite a lot of that lipid. They're part of the phospholipid structures. So the key to fatty acids influencing how cells are working, which in turn is influencing our health, our disease risk, a lot of it is about which fatty acids are found in the membranes of cells, okay? So if you're not eating a lot of omega-3s, you actually have a low amount of omega-3s in your membrane. And conversely, you have quite a lot of omega-6 fatty acids. But if you increase intake of omega-3s, they start getting into the membrane. Actually, this is quite strongly related to dose, to the amount you're eating. So there's a clear dose-response relationship between the amount people eat and the amount of EPA and DHA in cell membranes. So you've changed the composition of the membrane, you change how the membrane's functioning, you change actually the physical nature of the membrane. There's this thing called membrane fluidity, that's how liquid a membrane is. So because EPA and DHA are very unsaturated fatty acids, they make membranes more fluid. And you might imagine, oh, that's, that might be a good thing because the cells can move around in the bloodstream more easily, they can go through the nooks and crannies more easily because they've got fluid membranes. So part of it is about the membrane, and there's a lot of proteins in membranes also, and they have particular functions like receptors, for example, or transporters. And the way these proteins in membranes are functioning is partly determined by the lipid that's in their environment. So some proteins actually work better when there's more omega-3s in the membrane, in the environment of the protein. The best example of that is rhodopsin in the eye, which is the key to how we see properly, so the quality of our eyesight. So the protein that actually recognizes what we're seeing, it works better when it's in a membrane with a lot of DHA in it. And that's actually why babies need DHA to promote their visual development. So part of the answer is about what's going on in the cell membrane and these fatty acids getting into the membrane. That actually influences many ways that the cells are responding, including things like, what genes they're expressing, what proteins they're making. Then the other part of it is there are chemical mediators that are produced from polyunsaturated fatty acids. So people might be familiar with prostaglandins, for example, which are made from arachidonic acid. Those things are made for a purpose, but if we're making too much, that's actually one of the signs of too much inflammation, and that actually, some of those prostaglandins actually cause pain, cause fever, so it goes back to what you said before. So the other thing omega-3s do is they sort of keep omega-6 fatty acids in check. So we decrease the production of excess amount of these chemicals that cause inflammation, for example, and instead we make from omega-3s chemicals that calm inflammation down. So there's two components. One is to do with the membrane and the control of cell function, and the other is to do with the reciprocal control of chemicals made from omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, which often have opposing actions.
Yes. So arachidonic acid is that omega-6 in the cell membrane, and then we want the EPA DHA in the cell membrane to kind of balance it out. So what is the biggest lever predicting how much arachidonic acid is in the cell membrane? Because I've heard people say, oh, linoleic acid doesn't necessarily translate.
Yeah.
So it's not seed oils equal arachidonic acid. Can you talk about that? How does that determine?
Yeah, we have a pathway to make arachidonic acid from linoleic acid, but that seems to be, in fact, you mentioned Bill Lands, and this has actually been something Bill Lands worked on long ago. One of the things that we know is, although that pathway exists, it seems to be what's called saturated at quite a low level of linoleic acid. So what that means is varying linoleic acid in a diet where there's quite a lot of linoleic acid, for example in the US, actually doesn't change arachidonic acid levels. That's already like maxed out. So you've pushed that pathway as hard as it can go. That's maxed out. So that's a bit out of the question, or out of the answer to your question. The second thing is we eat some arachidonic acid. There are animal products that are very rich in arachidonic acid, or relatively rich. So, for example, red meat contains arachidonic acid. Eggs contain arachidonic acid. There's some in milk. So I think, people who eat more meat will have more arachidonic acid in their cell membranes because they're eating preformed arachidonic acid. So that's all on the omega-6 side. But actually, you talk about the interaction or the balance. So a diet low in omega-3s, particularly in EPA and DHA, creates an environment that favors arachidonic acid being in cell membranes, because it's like it's a bit like if you've got one chair at a table and you've got two people going for the chair, right? So one of them, let's say one of them is omega-6 and omega-3, the other is omega-3, only one of them's going to get to the chair. Now, if you've got 10 people in the room and 9 of them are arachidonic acid and 1 is EPA, it's obvious that more arachidonic acid is going to make it to that chair simply because there's more arachidonic acid in the room. So what you want to do is you want to decrease the amount of arachidonic acid in the room and increase the amount of EPA, and that will help control arachidonic acid levels. And we've actually found in some of our studies that some of the changes that we see in cell function when we give people EPA and DHA is actually, some of those changes are related to the ratio of EPA to arachidonic acid in the cell membrane. So this is this balance that you talked about is very strongly related to how well omega-3s are functioning and their ability to control cellular function physiology.
Yeah. And what is that balance like? Because I know even having more omega-6s, or I've read, can prevent the elongation, like the creation of longer chain. So can you talk a little bit about that? And like, what is the ratio? How much more arachidonic acid do we have by percentage?
So we've been talking about the competition between arachidonic acid and EPA and DHA to get into the membrane, basically. So that's one level of competition, okay? The second level of competition, as I mentioned, both arachidonic acid and EPA and DHA can give rise to chemicals that are associated with different things. So there's an interaction there. So again, if you have a lot of arachidonic acid and not much EPA and DHA, obviously you're going to be producing more chemicals from arachidonic acid. But the third element that I think you're alluding to is we do have the capability to make our own EPA, and there's a lot of debate about how well we can do that, but certainly some people can make their own EPA and DHA. Maybe everyone can make their own EPA and DHA from alpha-linolenic acid, but different people have different abilities to do that. And that pathway, so alpha-linolenic acid is 18 carbons with 3 double bonds. EPA has 20 carbons and 5 double bonds. So we have to make the carbon chain longer by 2, and we have to put 2 more double bonds into the chain, okay? So there's 3 enzymes in a row that do all of that. Delta-6 desaturase, elongase, and delta-5 desaturase. So I'm talking about omega-3 metabolism, but the omega-6 fatty acids share those same enzymes, okay? So again, this is a direct competition between these two families of fatty acids. So linoleic acid is metabolized by the same enzymes as alpha-linolenic acid, okay? So again, if you have a situation where you have a lot of linoleic acid, that's stopping you making your own EPA, okay? And actually so one way to try to overcome that is to actually consume more alpha-linolenic acid. So there's lots of nice studies done with flaxseed oil supplements and also putting flaxseed oil into foods. So there's some very nice studies with muffins made from flaxseed oil. So if you give people quite a lot more alpha-linolenic acid, you force that side of the pathway and you make more EPA, okay? But there's also, there's quite a few of those studies, but there's a few studies where people have done the opposite, which is they've decreased linoleic acid intake in an experimental situation. So people are maintaining alpha-linolenic, but they've decreased linoleic. And simply, if you decrease linoleic acid intake, you make more EPA. So that's a clear demonstration that linoleic acid is inhibiting the endogenous synthesis of EPA.
Perfect. So do you think seed oils are our main source, a big source of linoleic acid? Do you feel like people in America or in any part of the world would benefit? Like, is that a big lever they can use?
So I mean, I've talked a bit about linoleic acid and seed oils because I think most people or many people who are interested in omega-3s like me are also have some interest in omega-6s, but they're drawn into this issue that we're discussing, which is about the balance between them. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing to say is that linoleic acid, which is the main fatty acid component of the seed oils, there's no doubt it has roles in human health, okay? Yeah. So linoleic acid is essential. It's very, very important in the ceramides of the skin. Linoleic acid is very important for skin health. It also lowers cholesterol. It's the most cholesterol-lowering fatty acids. In contrast, some of the saturated fatty acids raise cholesterol. Mm-hmm. So, and I mean, there's lots of studies coming out now showing that higher intakes of linoleic acid are associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes, for example. So it's not that linoleic acid doesn't help us. It does help us, but we've got to get the balance right between these families. So in the US, you probably have the highest linoleic acid intake of anywhere in the world. Okay.
And what is that at about? Can you give us approximation?
So the adequate intake in the US is actually the average intake. So you don't actually know if it's adequate or not. So that's a convenience. So I think it's about 17 grams a day in men and 15 in women or something like that. So just for comparison, in the UK, it's about 11 grams in men and 9 grams in women. So you're getting on for almost twice the intake on average of linoleic acid than we have in the UK and in Western Europe. So I think so that will be bringing with it some of the benefits of linoleic acid, but it will also, I think, be contributing to a low status of EPA and DHA through inhibiting that pathway. People can help themselves by looking at the omega-6 side or by looking at the omega-3 side or looking at the two and trying to just rebalance things and get the health benefits of both families, I think.
Yeah. And what do you think? We'll talk about specific recommendations for how much EPA and DHA, but what do you think a good level of linoleic acid intake per day could be? Because people aren't going to avoid it entirely, and we don't want to. But like,
so I think, well, whether they wanted to or not, it's practically impossible.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a moot point. So I think, we don't actually know, if I'm honest with you, and you'll be aware, and the people listening in will be aware that there is a debate about seed oils and linoleic acid, and not everyone is taking the view that I put to you, that linoleic acid is essential and it has some very important contributions to human health. Some people have a completely different view. I don't support that view myself, so it's really hard to put a number on it, but it is linoleic acid intake in the US particularly has gone up a lot in the last let's say since the 1960s, and that is because of the emergence of seed oils, of seed oil-based margarines, of the use of grains in feeding livestock, for example. So you have more linoleic acid in meat and in milk than than your grandma had, and you have more in your meat and your milk than we have in Europe because we have different farming practices. So there's an argument that it's gone a bit too far, and I mentioned the average intake in US adults of linoleic acid. Let's say it's 18 grams a day for argument's sake. It doesn't matter whether it's 18 or 17, but let's say. And in the UK, let's say it's 10 grams. So, maybe somewhere in between is a good sort of intake. That would take some dietary change for people to achieve a reduction. But some people have argued the big issue is the lack of omega-3s in the diet, that we don't need to worry too much about the omega-6 side. Let's focus on getting people to have more omega-3s.
Yeah, and I like that approach too, because it's like it just gives you something to do. I think it's harder to be really mindful of which oil has how many omega-6s, and like canola, soy, they have a better they have more omega-3s.
So I think amongst the I'm going to call them seed oils because that's the term we're using. Canola oil has a better fatty acid mix than, let's say, like corn oil, maize oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil. They're really all very rich in linoleic acid, and with only modest amounts of anything else. Canola is a much better fatty acid mix. Soybean is somewhere in between. And both soybean and canola have alpha-linolenic acid, which the other seed oils I mentioned don't have. Those are the sort of things people might want to think about if, they want to stick with seed oils, but try to rebalance the omega-6 and omega-3 a little bit.
I love that. 2 quick questions. Well, does alpha-linolenic acid have benefits on its own? Or do you think we should be focusing a lot on EPA and DHA?
Yeah. So alpha-linolenic acid has always been viewed as existing to be a precursor for EPA and DHA. You could have a view that its main role is just to help us make our own long-chain omega-3s. It's really difficult to do a study actually in cell culture in an animal model or in humans where you give somebody alpha-linolenic acid to try to answer your question. Because what will happen is some of that alpha-linolenic acid is converted to EPA. So let's say you get an effect on, let's say, inflammation. So have you got an effect of alpha-linolenic acid on inflammation because alpha-linolenic acid has anti-inflammatory effects, or because some of it has been converted to EPA, which has anti-inflammatory effects? So I think that's the dilemma. There are cohort studies that relate alpha-linolenic acid to disease outcomes like risk of cardiovascular disease. But again, you don't really know whether that is, just a marker of the fact that people have got higher EPA. There are some chemical mediators made from alpha-linolenic acid that have their own biological properties. So, I mean, Autumn, I think probably the real answer is it's both of those things.
Yeah.
Alpha-linolenic acid probably has some effects of its own, but it's also a precursor for EPA. And this is also true of linoleic, of course. It has some effects of its own, but it's a precursor for arachidonic acid, even if that is like maxed out at the high intakes that we have.
Perfect. And we're going to, like I said, get really practical soon, but I just love to pick your brain. So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not super worried about seed oils. They're not necessarily toxic. And I've heard in other interviews, you're not necessarily worried about their breakdown products, but you're more worried about the balance. Like, can we just focus on the omega-3s, and how do we increase the omega-3s in our diet and in our cell membranes? That's the bigger picture, I'm guessing.
I think that's that's a really important question that we sort of know the solution in a way, but that we have to implement, I suppose. So we have to find ways for people to consume more preformed EPA and DHA, preferably from their diet. If we can't do that, we have to help them with their own metabolism, and that's where increasing alpha-linolenic acid could be important, but maybe along with dropping linoleic acid a bit to help the omega-3 pathway along.
Okay, perfect. So let's get into some of the really cool research coming out. I've been fascinated by pro-resolving mediators. And so can you talk about those? What are they, and like, why is this a very exciting finding?
We've mentioned inflammation a few times. So inflammation happens when our physiology is stressed, and it could be stress through an infection, could be stress through some sort of injury. I mean, these are the common things that initiate inflammation. And inflammation is designed to help us. We know quite a lot about what happens when inflammation is triggered, and the chemicals that are produced, the cells that are activated, how the process keeps going. And until it's now about 20 years ago, people thought that when inflammation has run its course, it sort of just like passively stops what it's doing. Because in physiology, things happen when you need them and then they stop. But people thought there was like a passive turning off of inflammation. But then people studied what was happening during what they thought was this passive phase, and it turned out the turning off of inflammation is actually an active event, and you produce chemicals that turn it off, okay? And that's where the idea of resolution came up. So resolution is the active turning off of inflammation. So you could think about it as like a light switch. You've turned the light on and you've turned it off. You could think about it, I mean, we call it a dimmer switch, where you turn the switch to make the light stronger or less strong. So when you're inflamed, you're turning the switch up, but when you're resolving inflammation, you're turning it back down again. This turns out to be an active process. So people looked for the cells and chemicals that were involved in the resolution of inflammation. There are proteins that are involved, just like there are proteins involved in the initiation and propagation of inflammation. There are proteins involved in the resolution. But just like there are lipid mediators, I mentioned prostaglandins before, made from arachidonic acid, they are involved in the initiation and propagation of inflammation. But just like there are lipid mediators involved early on, it turns out there are lipid mediators involved in the resolution of inflammation, okay? And most of those lipid mediators are made from EPA and DHA. There are some also made from DPA. Actually, arachidonic acid also gives rise to some pro-resolving lipid mediators. So together, these lipids that turn off inflammation have been called specialized pro-resolving mediators, or SPMs. Okay, so these include different families based on their structures. So we have resolvins. Some resolvins are made from EPA, some are made from DHA. We have protectins. They're made from DHA. And we have Maresins, they are also made from DHA. As I mentioned, DPA, which is the intermediate between EPA and DHA, also gives rise to some of the specialized pro-resolving mediators. So this is real exciting stuff in omega-3 functionality.
Absolutely. And I noticed that a broader class is created from DHA than EPA. And so that makes me think, and some people have trouble if they're just eating ALA, it's harder to get down to that DHA. So would you say that is an argument for paying special attention to DHA or? So
people, I mean, for 30 years, people always have been asking me this question, so I get asked the question 30 times a year, probably, if not more, which is more important, EPA and DHA?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's actually sort of what you're saying, but you're asking it in a different way. I think it depends on exactly what the focus of your discussion or your interest is. So there's absolutely no doubt that DHA is vital for visual development and brain development, and for cognitive and visual function. And EPA cannot replace DHA in that regard. Okay, so DHA is absolutely vital for visual and cognitive development and function. In the old days, we used to think EPA was much more important as an anti-inflammatory, because EPA is a very good antagonist of arachidonic acid. But the pro-resolving mediators made from DHA are very potent. I mean, I'm not sure of the potency of every single specialized pro-resolving mediator, but typically the DHA-derived mediators are really potent, not that the EPA-derived ones are not. So I think in terms of resolution of inflammation, DHA is probably very important. If you think about the brain, we have a lot of DHA in the brain and very little EPA. Brain inflammation obviously is a big problem. This is associated, I mean, obviously, brain trauma involves inflammation. That's serious stuff. But even cognitive decline has an inflammatory component. Even many of the psychological and psychiatric conditions have an inflammatory component. So I think neuroinflammation is super important, and controlling neuroinflammation, if you want to do it via SPMs, DHA has got to be your focus, because there's so much DHA in the brain and not much EPA. And in fact, I mentioned Protectin or Protectins as one of the family of the specialized pro-resolving mediators. So Protectins are made from DHA, and the one that's most studied is called Protectin D1. But when it's made in the brain, it's actually called Neuroprotectin D1, because it's been shown to be a protector of the neurons. So I think this is an example where DHA in the brain is very important in trying to control inflammation.
Yeah, I love that. And I have both genes for Alzheimer's. So, and I kind of wanted to do like condition by condition, because I've read your papers and you actually break it down for cardiovascular disease, EPA, and DHA's effects. But can we start with the brain there? Because from the literature I've read, EPA, like there's like people who have low levels of EPA or increase their EPA, when it comes to depression, they seem to do really well. But I'm wondering, is that different when it comes to like cognitive, like aging and Alzheimer's? Like, can you talk about that?
So I think there's two separate things happening. So one is in the brain, as I've already mentioned, we have quite a lot of DHA and we have relatively little EPA. Again, going back in time, that led people, I think, reasonably to think anything to do with the brain and omega-3s was going to be about DHA. Okay? Yeah. Now, I think within the brain itself, DHA is very important, obviously in the functioning of those cells, but I mentioned Protectin D1 and controlling neuroinflammation. So that's all about DHA. But what is interesting is where people have done research in people with, for example, depression or psychiatric or psychological disorders, EPA, oral EPA, seems to be quite effective. So EPA is doing something that's helping the brain function, for want of a better term, the neurological function in those people. And this could be, it could be something to do with inflammation, but not in the brain. But the signaling from that actually goes to the brain. It could be about blood flow. People have often said this is quite a lot of, is about increasing blood flow to the brain. And, EPA is very good at controlling vascular function. So I think EPA can have effects outside of the brain that have consequences in the brain. And this has to be an explanation for why, actually, where people have done a head-to-head comparison of EPA and DHA in some of these conditions, often it's EPA that works quite well and DHA doesn't do very much, which is very counterintuitive. But the explanation has to be that EPA has effects maybe not in the brain, but the effects it has are like transferred to the brain through normal physiology. Yeah,
so could it be that, because I know there's a subset of people who are depressed who, when you shut the inflammation off in their body, that depression can be resolved. So could it be that, okay, for those people who are a lot of people, inflamed today, that's working there. But if you're somebody who's looking to preserve like your cognition and maybe improve processing speed and memory and prevent Alzheimer's.
So DHA is going to be important then, I think the way you've expressed that is quite right. So if your target is outside the brain, but it may have a consequence for the brain, brain, then EPA may be the more effective. But actually, if you actually need to be in the brain to combat what's going on, DHA is probably more important there for sure. Yeah.
I love that. And I know you did a trial too, because DHA is very important for development, fetal development. And then you've given women salmon. And so I think another place where EP or DHA might be important is when you're going to have a baby or when you're of reproductive age. Would you agree?
This is a fascinating area, which, I mean, people have always been interested in omega-3s in pregnancy, but I think there are new things emerging that are going to ramp up that interest. I mean, it's already happening a bit, but in the next 5 years or so, there's going to be a lot of interest. Fertility itself is influenced by omega-3s, and actually that's in both in the man and the woman. So, for example, I know you're asking me about women and women's health here, which I'll come to in a second, but sperm is very rich in DHA. And both the head and the tail of sperm contain a lot of DHA, and sperm quality and sperm swimming is actually related to how much DHA is in the tail. And there are some studies showing if men take DHA supplements, they have more DHA in their sperm and the quality of the sperm is increased. So male reproductive capacity, if you like, maybe is related to omega-3 intake and status. Likewise, on the female side, omega-3 is very important for the egg and also the fertilization process. So when the sperm is fertilizing the egg, you have two cells coming together, right? And the membranes have actually got to fuse and then become one cell. So I talked right at the beginning about omega-3s and membrane fluidity. So you can imagine these membranes have got to fuse and actually two membranes have to become one. So having more DHA in both the head of the sperm and in the egg promotes this sort of fusion, which is, I mean, that's actually conception. So we've gone right to the beginning of life here. And then during pregnancy, so there's actually a new recommendation around omega-3s in preterm birth. So omega-3s decrease the risk of preterm birth and some other pregnancy complications. There is some research on gestational diabetes, but I wouldn't say we know for sure that omega-3s prevent gestational diabetes, but there is literature along those lines. It's a bit inconsistent. So actually the pregnancy, the health of the pregnancy from the maternal side is also favoured by omega-3s. Already talked about omega-3s and the infant brain and visual development. So the mother is passing DHA particularly across the placenta to the fetus and then in breast milk to the newborn baby. You're seeing you've got sperm and egg quality, you've got the conception process, you've got preterm birth risk, you've got gestational diabetes birth, you've got, fetal development, all needing EPA and DHA, different things maybe needing more DHA than EPA. So early in life, these fatty acids are really, really vital for sure. So there has been a recommendation for pregnant women, early pregnant women, to take omega-3s to decrease risk of preterm birth, for example. And, preterm birth will be a problem in... So it's more of a problem in certain countries, but even within your country and my country, there are groups in the population who have a much higher risk of preterm birth and early preterm birth. So, typically people in, lower socioeconomic classes, for example. So, there is a risk in the population and omega-3s can help with that.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. I hear a lot about the chemical burden, reducing fertility rates potentially, but I think this omega-3 deficiency is probably another big factor. So thank you for that. And then let's do a quick overview because I want to get to the really practical of the research. So not all research shows benefits, right, to supplementation, but a lot of it does. So what would you say are the strongest pieces of evidence for cardiovascular disease, muscle synthesis I've heard you talk about? Give us an overview.
So we have different types of, I'm only going to talk about human research. Other research is important for understanding mechanisms, but, the real thing in terms of either development of new strategies, development of policies, putting things into practice, we need human evidence for that. So we have two types of human study. One is like epidemiology, where you look at the association between A and B. For example, between how much omega-3s people are eating and what happens to them as they go along. Cardiovascular risk, for example, risk of cognitive decline, risk of different cancers. So the epidemiology of this is, I mean, epidemiological research. The epidemiology of fish, which are an important source of EPA and DHA, is extremely strong. In other words, there's really good evidence that eating fish is healthy. Let's put it like that. And also the epidemiology of EPA and DHA intake in the population and the levels of EPA and DHA in the blood of people in the population, in terms of higher intake and higher levels in the blood, are strongly associated with better health outcomes. So the epidemiology is super strong. Okay. Now, the inconsistency comes from randomized controlled trials, and they're usually done with like omega-3 supplements versus something like, vegetable oil or whatever. So we have trials that show obviously effects on cardiovascular risk factors like inflammation, blood triglycerides, blood pressure, heart function, so on. So often those trials looking at biomarkers work very well in that they demonstrate effects. The inconsistencies have come where people look at what they call hard clinical outcomes, which usually for cardiovascular disease is like dying.
Yeah.
So, cardiovascular mortality. So we have some very good studies using high doses and long follow-ups that demonstrate reductions in cardiovascular mortality, and we have other studies which also seem to be very good with high doses and long follow-ups that don't show that. So people grapple with the use of like supplemental omega-3s and how effective they will be. Some of the issues I think are dosing. For me, dose is really important. Yeah. Duration, you've got to study people for long enough. Other aspects of the diet, right? So, maybe coming back to your earlier question, maybe omega-3s work better if you have a low omega-6 background than if you have a high omega-6 background, for argument's sake. Maybe there are other things in the diet that help omega-3s to work. Maybe there are things in the diet that hinder them working, for example. Yeah. So I think other aspects of diet, but also you have, body fatness, I think is really important, because adipose tissue is a place for fat soluble things to be locked away. So if people have more body fat and they're given a particular dose of omega-3s, probably their adipose tissue is taking up more of the omega-3s than you would see in a normal weight person. And in studies, we always dose as just a gram per day dose. I have seen very few studies where people have dosed according to body mass index or body fatness or body surface area or something like that. I think that would be a really novel sort of study to do. So actually what that means is people living with obesity may need higher amounts of EPA and DHA to get the same effect as people of normal weight. So I think there's a lot of factors that might explain these inconsistencies. If you sit back and look at everything, the evidence for cardiovascular disease is actually quite strong, I think. It's the other conditions we've mentioned where the evidence is weaker. Partly because they haven't been studied quite so well, and also because sometimes they're harder to study. So cognitive decline, for example, that's really hard to study in a trial.
And which phase are they at? Pre-decline? Are you mild?
Yeah. So I think a study where you got people without cognitive impairment and you put them into a trial, and your hypothesis would be that omega-3s would stop or delay cognitive decline. That's going to be a long study, and it's going to be a very big study. Yeah. No one is going to pay for that study. So that study is never going to happen, okay? So what people typically have done is they've done studies in participants who already have cognitive decline. If you look at all of those studies, there's a sort of a signal that if people have mild decline, you can slow that with omega-3s. But if people already have quite significant decline, omega-3s don't help. I mean, that's like a general summary. So I think when the condition is mild, you've got the ability for something like omega-3s to slow it down, maybe even reverse it in some people. But when the condition, this is just an example, but when the condition has gone too far, omega-3s are not the answer as far as that condition is concerned. So I think that's another complication. Where what phase of a disease are you studying? How long are you studying it for? Human trials, which is where we get this evidence from, they're all about statistics. And, you need, for many of these conditions, you need big studies because, the effect is going to be, even cardiovascular disease, we're talking maybe a 20-25% reduction in cardiovascular mortality over 5 years. If you're one of those people whose life is saved. This is life or death effect.
Huge.
But still the majority of people are succumbing from the condition over the time. And when you're looking at something like Alzheimer's disease, the numbers are such that you need really big studies. And again, these become very expensive. They're big, they're long. Doing those studies is really hard. They need a lot of money.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I've read studies where, ADHD is improved, aggression is improved. And then two things I just want you to make a quick comment on before we pivot to the very practical is microbiome impacts and muscle synthesis.
Yeah,
I thought,
So you did ask about muscle, but I forgot.
That's okay.
So I mean, this is a super exciting area that is emerging. So there's actually literature going back quite some time, which often happens. People have done things, but it's never sort of caught on. In a way, people were ahead of their time. So there's some old studies showing that muscle protein synthesis and degradation are influenced by omega-3s. And I think part of that is to do with inflammation, because inflammation drives muscle protein breakdown, okay? So if you have anti-inflammatory actions of omega-3s in muscle, you can stop this drive to muscle protein breakdown, okay? So that's something actually I'm very interested in myself. It turns out that not only do you maybe reduce muscle protein breakdown, but there's quite good evidence that you can increase muscle protein synthesis.
Amazing.
With omega-3. So the way to think of this is, so muscle obviously is made from amino acids. Muscle protein is made from amino acids. So you need the amino acids. And it's triggered by anabolic hormones like insulin. So after a meal, you make muscle protein actually using the amino acids that come from the meal. So people have shown if you have given people omega-3s for a period of some weeks, that process is more effective. You get more muscle protein synthesis in response to insulin and amino acids when people's muscles are enriched in omega-3s compared to not. So there's a very interesting interaction between amino acids and fatty acids. And this is something I'm very interested in at the moment. So the applications in that, I mean, the obvious ones are, of course, in aging, because people are losing muscle mass with aging. But many diseases where you get more extreme or accelerated muscle loss, lots of cancers, for example, chronic inflammatory diseases like COPD, people are losing much more muscle. So I think these are very interesting sort of public health and clinical scenarios. But of course, the athletes and so on that are very interested in muscle and muscle protein, I think this is also something for them. So I think that's one area that is exciting and emerging. And the other one you mentioned, which is also exciting, is the gut microbiome. Because, of course, the gut microbiome, some people think is like the center of everything in human metabolism, human health, human disease, and so on. Certainly, gut microbiome plays a role. And it plays a role in lots of the things we've talked about, including our metabolism and metabolic disease. There is a gut-brain axis also. So there's a lot of work now on gut microbiota and cognitive function and neurological disease. Mostly when we think about prebiotics, so these are the things that feed the microbiome. People are thinking about carbohydrates, like particular types of non-digestible fibers, for example, fructooligosaccharides, inulin, different fibers. Certainly those things are prebiotics. They get different bacteria growing very well. But there's now, interestingly, quite a lot of papers showing that EPA and DHA also have a prebiotic-like action. So there are microbes that seem to thrive on EPA and DHA. When you think about someone, let's say they're eating fatty fish or they're taking omega-3 supplements. So most of the omega-3s are going to be digested and absorbed, right? So, we take them up. But fat digestion and absorption, even in healthy people, is probably about 95% efficient. So some of the fat we eat, we don't actually absorb, but it's a small amount. And for omega-3s, because we're eating so little, it's going to be a tiny amount that's escaping digestion. But anyway, there is good evidence from quite a number of human studies now that some EPA and DHA must be getting quite far down the GI tract, because you do get changes in gut microbiota. And many of the microbes that seem to come up are actually the health promoting ones. So, I mean, I believe omega-3s are mainly working through systemic effects after they've been absorbed into the bloodstream and are circulating around the body, contacting all our different tissues. But another element of that is also actually a prebiotic action promoting a more healthy gut microbiome. So I think there's probably a systemic and a non-systemic action.
Yeah, I think that's so exciting. I was reading like short chain fatty acid production, potentially like Akkermansia,
Yep.
lactobacillus. I mean,
Yep.
like so many
The
cool
classic,
implications.
the classic ones, yeah.
The
So,
classic
so,
one.
so it's really interesting that omega-3s are acting like classic prebiotics. But what is super interesting in this autumn is that the organization called ISAP, which is all about pre and probiotics, and they are the people who have published the definitions of probiotics, prebiotics, symbiotics, postbiotics, etc. So in their prebiotic definition paper, they have a figure of the possible prebiotics. And of course, this is dominated by fibers. But they actually already, when they made that definition, they had polyunsaturated fatty acids
Wow.
in a little box within the figure showing the definition. So I mean, people have recognized this effect for a little bit longer than we think. It's just that the data is really coming out now from human studies for sure.
That's what excites me about this topic. Like you said, you've been doing this for 30 years. I know we just talked to Dr. Michael Crawford. I mean, again, like researchers have
Yeah, well, he's
known.
been going for longer than me, Autumn. So
I know. Just a little. And then Dr. Bill Lance. I've talked to Dr. Bill
yeah,
Lance. I mean, people have
yeah,
been talking about this, and I hope that this is finally the era where we all start to implement this into public health policy and that it becomes something that we all understand. So thank you for your work. Now let's get practical.
yeah,
How would we start to increase our
yeah,
omega-3 status? What is the easiest steps we can take? What are your
yeah.
favorite fish? How often are you eating it?
Yeah.
Go crazy.
So this question of implementing is a really, this is a tough nut to crack, I'm afraid. So many countries and regions and even globally there are recommendations for intake of EPA and DHA. So we recently published it's sort of a systematic review of all of the recommendations. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I've seen it.
But
Yep.
we have some we have some nice tables in that paper showing the recommendations in all the different countries by age and by physiological state. So we have them for infants, for children, for adolescents, for young adults, for older people, in pregnancy, and so on. So that I think that's going to be a very good resource. There is some variation in the recommendations across the globe, but in general, we're talking about 400, 500, 600 milligrams of EPA plus DHA per day. A bit of an uplift in DHA during pregnancy for the reasons I mentioned. So these recommendations, many of them have been out there for a very long time. So for example, in the UK, the recommendation, which is at least 450 milligrams per day, was last set in 2004. So that's 22 years ago now. So a lot of these recommendations have been around for a long time. The problem, Autumn, is despite this, people are not getting anywhere near the recommendations, or at least 75% of people are not, maybe even more. And I mean, it depends. If you say 75% of people in the US, I mean, this is going to be highly variable according to geography. So
Yeah.
you will have some regions, for example, around the coast, where fish eating is much more part of the normal culture than it is like right in the middle of the country, for example. I mean, in some places it might be 90% of people, and in others it might only be 50%. But over the whole country, it's probably going to be about 75%. So what I'm putting to you is we have the recommendations in place for a long time, and people are not meeting them already. Okay, so we have to think about what can be done to encourage this. So in our country, we have a recommendation for people to eat oily fish at least once a week. So
Yeah.
fatty fish. Okay, now again, only 25% of people are doing that. So the recommendation is there. The fish are in the shops. They can be more expensive than alternatives, of course. But there are barriers to fish consumption in that a lot of people say I don't like fish. I don't like it. I don't like the smell. I don't like the taste. I don't know how to cook it. I like it, but the kids don't like it. I like it, but the husband doesn't like it. Whatever. So you've got the economic barrier. You've got the availability. So I mean, if you're living in the center of the country, your accessibility to these fish is less than living on the coast. I'm not saying you don't have accessibility, but it's less. But you might be paying a premium for that accessibility. So you've got the accessibility, you've got the economic, and you've got what I'll call the socio-cultural, which is just, there are people who eat fish and there are people who don't. Simple as that. We're talking about particular types of fish as being good sources of EPA and DHA. So I'm talking about, salmon, trout. You have different names for fish in the US,
Sardines.
but
Well, I'll say
sardines.
herring, mackerel. I've become obsessed with herring. Yeah.
Yeah, so herring is a very good source. Sardines are an amazing source. So even like a tin of sardines,
Fish roe.
You have those once or twice a week. You're going to get your omega-3s. Trout, mackerel. You mentioned mackerel are a very rich source. So that's the sort of fish we're talking about. Of course, the whitefish, which is a little bit more common, is a source of omega-3s, but at much a lower level. But I think if those whitefish, the non-oily fish, at least you're eating fish, you're getting some omega-3s, you're getting good quality protein and so on. So they are an alternative. If we're, there aren't really other foods that are giving us a lot of omega-3s, okay? Yeah. Companies have sometimes tried to enrich, so to fortify foods with fish oil, for example. They're niche products. In the UK here, when those products have been launched, they don't really catch on, so they don't last a long time. They're more expensive usually than the comparators. They're commodity products like milk or bread, for example, have been launched fortified with omega-3s. People don't buy them. They're more expensive. Bread is bread. People are going to buy the bread they like at the price they want to pay. So we have to think about other alternatives. So, this is where supplements can be important, Autumn.
Yeah.
So obviously there are different types of fish oil supplements, but there are other types of supplements, particularly algal, for example. Yeah. So algal oils, you have omega-3, EPA, DHA containing algal oils. These are suitable for, animal-free. So, if someone says, I don't, fish are a no-go area for me, that means fish oil is a no-go area for me. They do have an alternative in supplements, which is the algal oil supplements. Then I think the other thing is what we spend a lot of time early on talking about, which is trying to help your metabolism, help yourself make your own EPA and DHA, which is where alpha-linolenic acid comes in, and flaxseed oil, chia seeds.
And greens, like leafy greens.
And leafy greens, yeah. And also, as you mentioned, switching your seed oils maybe to canola and soybean away from, the really heavy linoleic acid ones. So helping your metabolism do it yourself. In this pathway from alpha-linolenic acid to EPA, there are a couple of intermediates. Mm-hmm. So there are emerging some like really niche plant oils that actually seem to be better converted to EPA than alpha-linolenic acid. So that could be something actually that comes a little bit more mainstream in the future.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And I don't know, you don't know this, but I did my dissertation on how the fatty acid profile of beef changes based on how it's fed. Upgrading your animal products to more pasture-based systems.
Yeah.
Across the board, especially when it comes to chicken and pork.
Livestock. And you mentioned red meat livestock, and you mentioned white meat livestock there.
Yeah.
They have a higher omega-3 content in their meat, and in fact in dairy cows in their milk, if they're fed on pasture compared to the rations that are commonly used in farming now. So I think a more pasture-fed, it doesn't have to be organic, but a more pasture-fed way of looking after your livestock is also part of the solution here. So then you get little bits of these helpful fatty acids in all these different foods, and together this helps people. They don't need to change their diet. They're just using a different type of the same sort of food that they're normally eating.
I love that. Yeah, and I just try to make it simple. And I do the canned. It's just like when I'm doing a lunch and on the go, it's usually like a mackerel or a herring or sardines.
Yep.
It's like cost effective. I do that twice a week. I do take a supplement, about 1 gram a day. If people are supplementing, what's the dose you think?
So I think so you've got to balance out the delivery of omega-3s and and the price that people, what you're going to spend on it. The effects of omega-3s are dose dependent. So, the more you take, the more benefit you're going to get. I wouldn't go crazy and start taking like 4 or 5 grams a day. But of course, the more capsules, the more supplement you use, the more concentrated supplements you buy, the more you're going to pay. And of course, there will be a section of the population who are willing to pay quite a lot for their supplements because they're buying, it's like health insurance, really. So that's fine. They can buy the more costly concentrated forms. They can take capsules 3 times a day if they want to. But I think for the normal, if I can use that word, the usual person, if you're worried about your omega-3s and you think your intake is really low, because you never eat fish, for example, take a capsule a day. That's going to increase. And if you want to take 2 a day, that's great. If you're taking are you taking 1 gram of EPA and DHA a day? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I take a little more DHA because, again, my Alzheimer's background, but I do, about 1 gram. And then I eat fish. I try to eat it at least 3 times a week.
So I think, I have a slide I sometimes use where I have a whole lot of recommendations and I put my recommendation at the bottom because people always ask me. And, I always say 1 gram a day, but this could be more. But, I
and
think
if you
1
weigh
gram
more,
is a good round number.
If you weigh more, would it be more? I'm sorry to interrupt. If it weigh more, I like that.
Yeah. So, I think I've got to come back to what I said before. So I think, we should be thinking about this maybe on a whatever, body weight, BMI, whatever basis. So I think if you I don't have a lot of evidence for this, but I think if you are bigger, you probably need to take more. Simple as that.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting. Dr. Anthony Holbert, I'm sure you're familiar with his work. But do you think, and this is, and then I only have one other question, if people take more, could that potentially promote like lower appetite, weight loss, improvement of muscle? Like, do you think that would help there?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is, so obesity is having excess body fat. And obviously there can be many morbidities that result from that, and also social things. But so there can be psychological implications of obesity. There can be social implications. But if we're thinking about the physiological stroke metabolic, the issue is not the body fatness itself, but what happens when people accumulate body fat, which is often, 2 things happen. One is they become insulin resistant, so insulin isn't working so well, so then their whole body metabolism is messed up. And the other is the adipose tissue becomes inflamed, and the inflammation chemicals leave the adipose tissue and go out in the bloodstream, and they have, I'll call them secondary inflammatory effects in places like the liver, maybe the muscle as well. So then you get the comorbidities of obesity, which are things like type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and so on. Maybe even some muscle loss. Intervening in a way that sorts out adipose tissue biology, by which I mean improving insulin sensitivity and dampening inflammation, can help with all of these comorbidities of obesity. So a person may not necessarily lose fat or lose weight, but their metabolic health could improve because you've actually made the adipose tissue more healthy, okay? So that's actually something we're quite interested in. So I think it's a sort of an answer to your question, that you can sort of treat the adipose tissue and that helps in the whole body setting. And that may happen actually without you losing body fatness. Of course, many people are also interested in decreasing body fatness. This is the trend with the GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs. Right. And, that itself is health promoting, although there can be, I think, there are adverse consequences of, maybe it's the rapid fat loss, maybe it's the fat loss per se, maybe it's that other things are happening because, people get dampened appetite. So now they're eating less of everything, and that includes vitamins, minerals, and omega-3s. So, maybe some people were already not getting enough of those things. Then they get treated, their appetite goes down, so they're actually eating even less. So, they become less obese, but they become more essential nutrient deficient. So I think this is something we really have to get our heads around and come up with good interventions for those people.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. We have to focus more on the quality of the food, the nutrients in the food. So thank you, Dr. Calder. This is amazing. So my last question for you is tell people where to connect with you. Let us know if there's anything you think we missed. And are you tracking your omega-3 index? Do you think that's a useful metric people should be aware of?
Yep, so omega-3 index I talk about quite a lot. So omega-3 index I think is very valuable because it tells you, so how much EPA and DHA you eat sort of determines your omega-3 index. So it's telling you about what you eat. Secondly, so omega-3 index is EPA plus DHA in red blood cells, okay? And the reason that's good is because red blood cells are very easy to get hold of. You just need a blood sample. But also their fatty acid composition is very stable over a long period of time. So they're like a long-term indicator of EPA and DHA intake. So they're telling you about what you eat. But the fatty acid composition or the EPA and DHA content of red blood cells is closely related to the content in a lot of tissues, including the human heart. So, of course, we're interested in the functioning of the heart, the brain, the liver, muscle, and so on. So if you have a blood marker that's related to the tissues, because we're not going around sampling those tissues very often, so omega-3 index is also associated with the omega-3 status in the organs, many of the organs, not all of them. But thirdly, omega-3 index is strongly related to future disease risk, particularly cardiovascular disease. So, and Bill Harris is the expert in that area. So if you haven't had Bill Harris, you need to get Bill Harris on. So omega-3 index is a marker of intake, status in other tissues, and future disease risk, in other words, health. So it's a really super marker. So, like you, I eat fatty fish quite regularly, several times a week. I'm a great fan of sardines, and I'm a great fan of salmon, and I'm a great fan of mackerel. So, I eat oily fish quite a lot. I also do take omega-3 supplements. So I take one concentrate a day. So that's about, I think it's about 850 milligrams. So I think, I believe these fatty acids are really important, but my belief is based on the scientific evidence. So, I think we have to be active in doing something about that ourselves, for sure.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Calder. This has been amazing. And can they connect with you if they want? If someone wants to reach out and talk to you, what would they do?
Yeah. So, I don't want to be inundated with 10,000. I don't know how many people are going to listen to us.
Yeah. But could they find your work on the website at University of Southampton? Where can you connect with your work?
So, if you do a Google search on Philip Calder, University of Southampton, you'll find my webpage for sure. Right. And that will have my email address. It will have publications. It's got a little mini bio and so on. But actually, even if you just do a Google search on my name or my name in omega-3s, you will find out information about me. You'll also find quite a lot of other podcasts and things like that. So, people can find out a lot of stuff from just a simple Google search.
Yeah, well, I thank you again. I think this is one of the most, I really believe it's one of the more important issues of our time. Like if we could get people excited about omega-3s and implementing that change in their lives, I do think we would move the needle in a very positive direction in mental health, physical health, and everything else. So thank you. Thank you for your work here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.